Dober večer, lepo pozdravljeni na masterclassu. Vsekakor nam ne pobegnite po koncu masterclassa, ob 20. uri vas toplo vabimo na prav posebno zaključno prireditev tukaj na tem odru. Vstopnine ne bo, bomo pa vse skupaj zapakirali v animacijo in ne v animacijo, v strip, v živo. Namreč z nami bojo Ciril Horjak, ki bo risal na veliko platno, kar mu boste pomagali s predlogi, ki mu jih boste pomagali dati vi. Pobiral jih bo pripovedovalec Rok Kušlan, zraven pa bo na čelo igral še Žiga Golob, nekje vmes pa bomo podelili še nagrade za najboljši strip letošnjega leta. Tako da le ostanite z nami, morebiti bo kaj tudi za popit po koncu, če mogoče to pretehta in pripomore k vaši odločitvi, ali boste ostali kasneje ali ne. Vsekakor pa naj toplo povabim na oder Petra Kupra. V tretje nam je uspelo, korona nam jo je malo zagodla, da ga nismo mogli videti v preteklih letih, ampak to tudi pomeni, da imamo že kar 3 njegove prevode v slovenščino, 2 narejena po kratkih zgodbah Franca Kafke, ampak dela pa še ogromno drugih stvari, predvsem angažiran strip, direktno iz New Yorka, torej končno, third time's the charm, right? Prihaja Peter Kuper. Let's invite him to the stage.
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming. I'm sorry I couldn't be here last year when I had an exhibition, but COVID, you know how that is. So, do I just hit forward? Oh, all right. I'll start with that. So, little walk through my career here. Early drawing. My mom. So there I am in first grade, and the reason why I put this up is because I was the shortest kid in class, and the third from the right is my friend Seth DeBachman, age 6, and he and I started a magazine. We did a fanzine together when we were 11, and then when we were 19 or 20, we started a magazine called World War III Illustrated, which we've continued to publish to this day. So we're now on our 43rd year. So I'm going to talk about a few of my influences. An important one was a movie called Failsafe. And in this movie, it's a Cold War era movie, United States versus Russia. The U.S. accidentally bombs Russia. And in order to avoid World War III, we allow them to bomb one city. And that city happened to be New York City, where I wanted to move from Cleveland, Ohio. And I was 8 years old when I saw this, and that exploded in my brain. I went to sleep that night like there exists a bomb that can blow up all of New York City. And in a funny way, this has been a very positive thing in my life, because I'm always working towards I have to finish this book before they drop the bomb, and I have to make love before they drop the bomb. Whatever it is, it's a motivator. So I'm not so happy with this motivation these days, but it's been an ongoing background. Another important thing for me was Mad Magazine, which it's a humor magazine in the United States, very, very popular in the 1970s especially. And through some strange evolutionary process, they asked me to try out for taking over a comic strip called Spy vs. Spy. And I tried out for it, and I really wasn't looking to get the job. So what I did was I took the black and white ink drawings that they had normally done. The creator, Antonio Prohias, who started the strip as a Cold War U.S. versus Russia comic strip, and I did it in stencils and spray paint, thinking that they would just go, no, thank you. But they said, yes, thank you. And I just finished my last one in August. And there's a cover I did for them. It's a story of just the insanity of war and two guys killing each other every story and then coming back to do it again. One of my first jobs, oddly enough, ironically perhaps, was inking. That's putting ink lines over pencil of somebody who knew how to pencil, Richie Rich. And this came in handy later when I wanted to do a parody about George W. Bush. And that I found pretty much everything, I hope that everything I work on will somehow find a use. So I grew up in the 1970s, and this is a very popular symbol, it still is. I saw a picture of the man who created it. He was very sad. He just had a sad expression. He created it for a life insurance company. But growing up in the 70s, there was the Vietnam War as a kind of a backdrop. So I wanted to do happy art, but somehow I had all these other images coming in, and that combination of the Mad magazine and terrible things probably affected my sense of humor. So you may not recognize him or even know who this is. I hope you don't. It's Ronald Reagan. He was coming up to be president when I was in art school, absolutely horrified by this thought. And so my friend and I, thinking Seth from that old picture, and I thought we may be going to war because there was a hostage crisis in Iran, and there was a lot of talk about bombing Iran and the possibility of a World War III with Russia. So that's why we came up with the title World War III Illustrated. And my contention is that as long as we keep publishing the magazine, World War III won't happen. So far, so good, but fingers crossed. So this is the first issue. We did this when we were in art school. And the idea wasn't just to publish our own work, which we did, but also to publish the work of other artists that we saw who were talking about things like Ronald Reagan and homelessness and, a million things. And that would be put up on a wall, would be posted on a lamppost, and then the first rain, it would wash away. And we wanted to capture these kinds of images and let people know that people felt differently than what you necessarily saw in the mainstream. And over the years, lots of different people joined us in publishing it. We'd never be able to do it if we didn't have a large group of other editors and many artists for each issue. So year after year, we just kept on having new issues, and we were hoping that we would affect the excuse me, get my water here, would make big changes in the world, that it didn't as much as we hoped for, but at least it was a reaction to what was going on, so that that we could note that there were artists out there who were fighting against many of the terrible things that were happening in our country and around the world. This was especially important right after 9/11, because virtually all of the artists that were working on the magazine were in New York and were witness to the World Trade Center coming down. I could see smoke rising from the bottom of Manhattan from my studio. And so we very quickly put together an issue, and where we normally would have sold 1,000 copies or 2,000 copies, and the people that would come to our release party would be mostly contributors. Suddenly people were interested and hungry for alternative media, and we sold about 5,000 copies, and in fact ran out of copies and had to go back to press. This is the cover by Mirko Ilic that we did right before we went into Afghanistan and Iraq, saying, bad idea, but I told you so's don't really work. So this is the last issue I edited last year. So for the first maybe decade or longer in my career, doing comics was almost like a hobby because I couldn't get paid for it very much. And there were just a few sources. I worked for Heavy Metal magazine occasionally, and maybe small underground comics, but there weren't too many places to get published or get paid. And so I turned to illustration, and that kept me going for many years. And I found that it fit with my sensibility to be able to work on a short deadline and talk about the subjects that were being talked about in newspapers and magazines. There were a lot of alternative papers, which were free papers they gave out in the city. Virtually all these have vanished now after the crash of 2008. So here's an example of the process. So I get a call from an art director at about noon, and while he's telling me what the story is about, I'm starting to sketch. At about 2 o'clock, I have to send him this sketch and some idea of what I'm doing. Then he sends it back to me. At this point, it was by fax, and with where the headline would be placed. And then I do a tighter pencil. That's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And then I work on this until about 6 or 7 and deliver it, and 2 days later, it's on the newsstand. So it's a very quick turnaround for these kinds of illustrations, and I found I started getting hired more as long as I made those deadlines. So one of the first graphic novels, long-form graphic novels I was able to do and get paid for was The Jungle, adapting a book from 1906 by Upton Sinclair, and it was about immigrants moving to Chicago and working in the meatpacking industry. And I really wanted to show off the possibility of what I saw I could do with comics, and nobody was doing stencils and spray paint in comic format. Well, my friend Seth actually had done them, and I saw a few things he had done, and I was completely inspired by it, and I turned to this as the style direction I was going to go. And I tried to do as many things as I could that weren't, normally traditional comics. And this is an influence. Brecht was talking about George Grosz as an influence, and he was also an influence on me, and some Russian constructivism. But looking outside of comics for inspiration is a really important thing, because one of the problems with comics is people tend to look at other comics to get ideas about doing comics, and it's kind of like a zombie form where it's eating on its own information, and so to break out of that, you have to find different sources. I did a lot of autobiographical comics in the 90s. There's my unauthorized autobiography. This got actually optioned by HBO, and I spent a year and a half developing an animated show that then crashed and disappeared, as so many things do in a career in the arts. In 1995, there was an editor that I had worked with who was really into comics, and he'd done some very small publications and worked on publications like High Times and a guitar magazine, and I did work with him at all the different stages in his editing career, and surprise, surprise, he got a job at DC Comics, Vertigo, and big publisher of Superman and Batman, and he asked me if I had any ideas for a graphic novel or comic. And I had this one kicking around for some years that I'd been developing and didn't know where it was going to go, but I wanted to do some kind of complicated story where sets of different characters were interacting, and it came out of having gone on the subway regularly and getting on the same train, and there'd be a kind of a different cast of characters, and I wondered, would that person cross paths with me later? Might this person save that person's life? Might I do something that would impact this person? And it developed into the idea of all these different characters that would be crisscrossing throughout the story. But again, I wanted to do something that was not traditionally done in comics, because I was very much interested in kind of like saying, look, this is an art form that you can do a million things with, and it's really in its infancy. We haven't explored this very much. So this is my traditional process. That is just a regular small piece of paper, and I figured out what would happen on each page by just writing it down like this. This is called a thumbnail. Because although I decided to make this a wordless book because I hadn't seen any of that being done in mainstream comics, but in order to get paid as a writer, also I had to write a script, so I wrote out a script for it. Then I do these little booklets. I draw it up from my thumbnail idea. I do it in these little tiny booklets. I make them so that I can flip through it like a comic and read it. And then I blow that up, and using the information in the small booklet, I do a same size as print pencil drawing. Then this I enlarged 25%, photocopied it, and cut it as a stencil. Completely insane approach that nobody was rushing to follow me in. But just it's almost a beautiful art object in itself. I use regular old spray paint, put on a mask, totally toxic, and I spray red paint and then black paint on top of that. And what you get is this underspray. And what I love about this is you can't predict what it's going to do. It's going to do its own thing. Sometimes it bubbles. I aim my cans at it, but the black is aimed, but it spreads out and goes in the air, and I breathe it in and probably get cancer later. I spray this on watercolor paper, and then I can add in additional color that I wouldn't be doing in separate stencils, and some lines on the panels, although I let things kind of blur together. This is another one of those. And I figured out ways to move from one scene to the next, using something that they talk about in film called a form cut, where you see it might be like you're looking at a plate with food, and then it turns into a car wheel, and that's how you get to a new situation. So I used some of these techniques that I got a lot out of looking at Alfred Hitchcock movies. And that's when it's colored. So another important influence for me has been travel. When I was 10, my father, who was a professor at university in Cleveland, had a sabbatical year, and we flew to Luxembourg, where they bought a VW camper van, and then we made our way around Europe on our way to Israel. And we lived in Israel for a year, and when I went back, and I got attacked by a woman when I was trying to draw her. Then years later, my wife and I wanted to experience more of this travel. We actually had met on a trip traveling in Spain, and we took an 8-month trip through Africa and Southeast Asia. And the work I was doing on that trip, when I got back, it was my sketchbook, basically, and some writing. I made a proposal for this book, and this was in 1989 and 90, and I went around to a dozen publishers and got turned down by everybody. They had no interest in graphic novels or comics or anything like that, and this was sort of a hybrid anyway. And the last place I had gone to returned my proposal, and they accidentally had left the intercompany memo that said, essentially, this is a piece of shit that I don't know why anybody would want to publish it, telling another editor this. And I saw this, I was shocked, and I was like, that's it, I'm done. And then I was at a comic convention, and one of the guys who created the Ninja Turtles had started a publishing company, and they were like, we're publishing sketchbooks. And I was like, okay, what about this? And they said, sure. And I got my book published. This is a trip I took to New Guinea. And these are some of the sketchbook pages from through the years. And this has been an opportunity, working in a sketchbook has been an opportunity to explore and try different styles, not worry about, the commerce of it, but that is nonetheless turned into a lot of the jobs I've gotten. So having had this experience where I lived in Israel for a year when I was 10, my parents just dropped me into the local school. I didn't speak Hebrew. I immediately got beat up a lot. I had a terrible time for about the first 6 or 7 months. I had to change schools. I got beat up at the second school. And so my wife and I had a daughter, and when she was 9, I thought, I want her to have the same experience. And part of that experience was the thought of a better language than Hebrew that's a little more useful. Not that Hebrew hasn't come up every once in a while in New York City, but Spanish would be better. And we kind of randomly chose this town pronounced Oaxaca in the south of Mexico. And I thought we were going to go to this sleepy little town, and this was in 2006, and it was during the years of George W. Bush, which were horrible years in the United States, and I thought I would just get a break from politics. I had been drawing political cartoons and illustrations and foaming at the mouth about what a horrible situation we were in, And I thought it'd be really great. We'll have a year off, and I'll just draw sketches of beautiful things. And this is kind of the way I do it in my sketchbook. I'm just draw, and then I might take some pictures of things, and then I watercolor later or on the spot. It's a mixture of different collection of things. But even when I'm sitting on the beach, I can't help but think about the bomb. It happened, though, we failed to do our homework, and we did not know that there was a strike going on in this sleepy little town of Oaxaca. And the strike was an annual event. It had been happening for the last 25 years. But this year, for the first time, instead of giving the teachers who were striking a pay raise, the governor decided he would attack them and push them out, and that would be that. And that didn't work very well for him, and it ended up that they hunkered down and were in this town square for 7 months. And maybe 20 Mexicans were killed during that time period. Just randomly, the governor would send his men to shoot them. And then one North American journalist was shot, and then it was an international deal, and they sent in federal troops. So this sleepy little town became a scene with federal troops. And I was like, it's not that I need to escape politics. I just want different politics. So I started drawing that. These were some of the scenes in Oaxaca at the time. That bus is not going anywhere. And as I was drawing these things, I posted some of them on the web, and my French publisher saw them and said, you mind if I spread some of those around? I ended up doing a little bit of writing, and then I was sort of functioning a little bit as a journalist and getting some of the sketches I did and the writing about it published, because a lot of the news stories that were covering what was happening were being written in Mexico City, which was 8 hours away, and very often what the governor was telling them was going on, not necessarily what was actually going on, or at least what I saw. And this was an article about the North American journalist who was killed there. It happened that Brad Will, this person, had done some work for World War III on an issue that I hadn't edited, so I didn't know him, but he was a local fixture in New York, in the Lower East Side New York scene. And then I heard very much about him when he was killed. And he actually filmed himself getting killed. He was running towards the action with a movie camera, and it's horrifically dramatic. So my wife and I had a date night one night, and I had heard there was a march downtown. I was like, I want to go do a little drawing. And she was very understanding for the first 2 hours, I think, and then was like, can we go? This is not very romantic, just watching you draw. So we started to walk away. We went around the corner. We probably had just reached our car, and unbeknownst to us, the federal troops attacked. And this turned out to be the end of the 7-month strike. They arrested 150 people. And I looked on the internet when we got home, and there was scenes of people bloody and burning buses, and we just narrowly missed this. And I finished the drawing from the images I saw on the internet, and then wrote a piece about this for World War III and a few other places. And a journalist in Mexico City, had seen some of my work and interviewed me. It was a very strange circular thing to have, where I was covering something in Mexico, and a Mexican journalist was contacting me to cover me covering it. While I was in Mexico, I met a Mexican publisher and made a little connection with them. And when I got back home, I realized we started talking about doing a book, and I realized all these things I've been doing in my sketchbook and the writing I've been doing for an arts website, all for free, except for those little things that I sold, were actually could become a book, and they agreed to do it. And I said, maybe we could do it bilingual, because then tourists could buy the book or something like that, which the truth was, I was afraid that all my friends who didn't speak Spanish wouldn't be able to read it. I'd sell about 15 copies of it, and that would be that. But it turned out that an American publisher also was interested, and they did kind of a double edition, and the book has remained in print, and the latest edition, updated with my most recent sketches from Mexico, came out last year. Another inspiration from this time in Mexico, which ended up being 2 years, we extended it by a full year. I wanted to do a story about the time and doing another autobiographical story didn't seem so interesting. I didn't cover everything I wanted. And I had this sort of a notion of doing something where it was a fictional account of a couple moving to Mexico, but at the same time telling the story of the monarch's migration. And I don't know if you know how this goes, but the monarch butterfly in the United States, it goes from Canada and it flies all the way 3,000 miles down to a particular forest in Mexico. And we went and visited that forest while we were living there. And it's one of the world, a natural occurrence that is, it's you just, even if you see it on film, you can't believe it. Even being there, it was surreal. The trees were so filled with butterflies that with their wings folded, it looked like fall leaves, and it would be pulling the branches down because there was, and literally millions of them flying past your face, and it was like, it was so incredible. They brushed by your cheeks. I did think, if it were, say, cockroaches or flying monkeys, it would be less exciting, but butterflies were so beautiful. And I thought I would weave the story of the migration of the monarch along with the migration of this couple to Mexico. And here's the monarch story and all the things they pass. And it could work in kind of a political subtext commentary just by what they passed. Like, in this case, flying over the strip mining in West Virginia. And that is a pencil drawing, and now then it's an ink drawing on paper, and then I digitally colored it. And so I mix medias a lot. So the couple is flying down to Mexico, and I thought, well, when they get to Mexico, perhaps the flavor of Mexico is not so digital, and so I wanted to draw it more like my sketchbook with watercolor and colored pencil and something that was more the flavor of there. I don't know if you know this, but when you look down on a word balloon, they're actually only this thick. So these are the fun things you can do with comics. So I threw in some history, and it gave me an opportunity to really put in the kitchen sink, as they say, of information that I got in the 2 years we were there and all the things I studied. And then the characters in the book, a lot of them were the people that we knew while we were down there. And instead of the case where my wife and I had walked away from this event, I put my characters right in the middle of it, and they got tear gassed, and so I could tell the story more from the inside. When I got back to the United States in 2008, it was just in time for the economic crash and for my career to crash. And I suddenly, all the magazines I worked for disappeared. I probably had 3 full career crashes in the arc of years I've been working, and it's it's one of those moments where I realize I have no backup plan. I have to do no plan B. I have to do this. Well, the Mexican publisher said, "Hey, how would you like to illustrate Alice in Wonderland?" and for a Spanish edition. And I was stylistically floating around. I didn't want to do stencils and spray paint anymore. It was curiously George Bush, as he exited, so did that style. It was like that quality of urgency that you get from stencil and spray paint that feels like something sprayed on a wall. Didn't feel right, and all the influences of Mexico came into this. And the original book, illustrated by John Tenniel, he used political figures from his era, and I thought it would be appropriate for me to use them in mine. So there's George W. Bush as the Mad Hatter. That's Stalin and Trotsky fighting in the background. So it was good to have sort of a reference point for these things. And I had a tremendous time doing this and stylistically moving around, trying something different. And there's another political figure. I don't know if you know Richard Nixon, but that was one of the evil presidents we had when I was growing up. And there's my daughter as Alice. And this also came in handy for this reference point when another evil political figure showed up. I did this actually before the 2016 election for The New Yorker. So sadly, I missed the exhibition of my work last year, and would have loved to have seen it in person, but thanks for the photos, and thanks for publishing it here too. So Kafka is in 1988, a friend of mine was reading Kafka over beers, reading a story aloud, and we were just laughing out loud. And I always thought of Kafka as being very dark and sad, and I recognized the humor in it, and it immediately jumped out as this would translate so beautifully into comics. It'd just be such a great association. And I started doing I did my first adaptation in 1988, and I did them over the years, mostly not getting paid, mostly self-publishing them in World War III, and they slowly started forming into a book. And the thing that's so great about Kafka is that his, what he's talking about can be talking about what's going on right now. The sort of fear, wanting to, like build a wall, hide ourselves away. That quality, I found that I could take his words and I'd see what I wanted to see in them. And I recommend that you go to his original text if you haven't recently or at all, and see how you might interpret it, because it really is, the beauty of Kafka is the variety of interpretations, and I see it through my lens. And so, I don't think Kafka had Donald Trump as one of his characters, but it worked for me as a stand-in for this particularly evil, stupid captain. And the joy in this particular story is that the captain dies, which at the end, but not that I wish death upon too many people, but occasionally. And the Hunger Artist, I actually did the story where I had a man as the Hunger Artist, which is how he was portrayed in the Kafka story, and I rethought that after the book was originally published, and then when it went back to press, I redrew it as a woman, and I thought it seemed like it was not only more appropriate in some ways, but it was another layer on the story, and I keep finding these layers of possibility. And again, I know I'm overlaying my own experience and sensibility and ideas, but for example, Before the Law became a story about civil rights and the difficulty in getting the law to respond to you. So some years later, after I started doing this, I returned with the Metamorphosis. So there's our Franz Kafka. And when I thought about working on this, I wanted to see what comics had been being drawn at the time that Franz Kafka was writing the Metamorphosis. And I found these amazing comics from the turn of the century that were done actually, around his time. But I mean, he might have actually seen some of these. This is Lionel Feininger, and all full color normally. Dream of the Rare Bit Fiend by Winsor McKay it could be written by Kafka. And here's just another example. You don't have to read along. It's more the general idea. You are a puzzle to me I don't seem to solve. You are a riddle, a conundrum. And at the end, he allows his characters to wake up, which Kafka really never does. This was also actually, the Dream of the Rare Bit Fiend was made into a 1906 film by a French director. It's really funny, the earliest film went for documentary, just having a camera on the street, show you what was going on in daily life, and then special effects. They jumped on special effects very early on. Another artist from that time, Frans Masseriel, was somebody that I had always been looking at, but stylistically seemed, fitting with the tone of Kafka. He does these wordless woodcut books. There was the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and it's, stylistically, this is all, you knew it was like the zeitgeist of that time period that Kafka was writing in. Another wordless book, a woodcut book by Lynn Ward. This was done in 1929. And it just, again, it had the flavor. And I grew up, I in my art school days, I was looking at his work a lot. And it was, some of the influences. Also, a lot of German expressionism like Kathy Kollwitz and John Hartfield. And these were artists who were doing this amazing work And many of them had to flee when Hitler came to power. They were really taking a chance. George Gross. So right before I did the Metamorphosis, The Simpsons people asked me if I wanted to do a Treehouse of Horror. So I thought, why not have Homer wake up one day to find, oh, he's a bug. So to get rolling with a story like this, I start sketching the character. I realized I couldn't do a faceless bug for the main character. You know, in the story you can visualize his expressions, but when I'm drawing him, it just seemed like you needed more to hold on to and relate to. Also, Kafka said, whatever you do, don't put the bug on the cover, and I went and did that. But I felt like I wasn't stepping too far out of bounds, because he also said to his best friend and executor, Max Brod, burn all of my manuscripts when I die, including unpublished manuscripts, including virtually every story I ended up adapting. And I figured if his best friend could ignore his wishes, I could step out a little bit. So then gathering reference, of course, and these were back in the days I'd go to the library to get reference. Even though there was an internet, I still found myself doing that. And I thumbnailed the stories again. This is just a small piece of paper like that. And I have to get a lot of information on there that if I can remember what I put down, that's the little booklet. It's about this big. And then as I tighten up the pencil, figure out directions and things I want to do. Now for this book, instead of, I'd been doing stencils and spray paint, I also played with something called Scratchboard. And that's a chalk-covered paper that you can put ink on and then scratch away at and get kind of a woodcut effect. So that's when I'm starting to put the ink on it. And then when I, whoopsie, oh, I guess I'm missing that panel. Anyway, you can scratch and get the woodcut effect that you saw in those other drawings I was showing. The US publisher who did Kafkaesque said, we'll publish Kafkaesque, which is what I was in the middle of working on, if you would adapt Heart of Darkness. And it certainly was up my alley to do this book, although, of course, it's quite a contentious book, and there's a lot of itchy parts to it that I had to address. There's Joseph Conrad in the days when he went to the Congo and went upriver in this little tiny boat. And he kept a journal, and I actually had the good fortune to go to Harvard, and at the library they have his original journal, and I got to thumb through it. It was really, I felt like I was looking at a talisman of something through time. And he did little drawings too. And so when I was working on this stylistically, I thought I want something more like my sketchbook. And so I worked with a black pencil and watercolor. It's still, you know, many ways, I like to play with the storytelling. In many ways, it's a very straightforward comic storytelling. So through the years, there have been many adaptations, or I should say editions of Heart of Darkness. And it was interesting to see all the various ways people interpreted, at least for the cover, the story. And on and on. Orson Welles actually wanted to do a movie of it, and got tripped up with funding, and so he dropped it and he went to this other small project called Citizen Kane, which did end up being A-OK. But he did get fairly far in the process, and there's a little radio reading he did of Heart of Darkness. And there were some early television versions of it, mostly really terrible. And then the ultimate version, which is Apocalypse Now, where it was transformed to taking place in Vietnam. But it's a pretty close reading of the story, and references all the details of it quite beautifully. This was a really terrible adaptation that came out in the 70s. There was a play, a video game, even two, and Perfume. They go too far. So one of the difficulties in taking a book that's from 1899 and bringing it into the 21st century is dealing with the colonial perspective from that time. So Chinua Achebe, a writer from Africa, said that white racism against Africa is such a normal way of thinking that its manifestations go completely unremarked. And he felt that Heart of Darkness should be taken out of the canon of great literature. But I read also that Obama had said, see, the book's not really about Africa or black people. It's about the man who wrote it, the European, the American, a particular way of looking at the world. So when I approached it, I thought, I have to take this twisty story and maybe I can sort of turn the perspective on it a little bit and make it a little bit from the Congolese perspective, to the extent that instead of it all being the white man on the boat looking out at Africa, that maybe it could show the people in Africa looking back at the white man. In this case, in the description, he's saying we were shooting these cannonballs into this faceless wall of trees, and I thought, well, it's not really faceless, it's filled with faces who are being hit by the cannonballs. And so without changing the text, I could actually change the context a bit. And I tried to do that as much as I could in bringing in that perspective, not just throwing it off as a side detail, because a lot of the Congolese figures were kind of cardboard cutouts in the book, and this is what I could do to put them more in the forefront of this adaptation without really changing the words. And again, this approach that I've used, I thumbnail the book out like this, really small, because I can change my mind, erase things, move things around more easily. And as soon as it starts to get to a bigger size, I don't want to change anything. It's just like erasing a whole page or throwing something out is heartbreaking, and especially on a deadline, it's difficult to. I don't have that much time to waste. So then I went to a tighter, small drawing yet, but I blew up the little squares, and here's an example. If you look at that, keep that in mind when you see this tighter drawing. So even though it's a little rough thing there, you can actually see some of the elements that I have in this, which is my little booklet, and then that became a 2-page spread in tighter pencil, and then I did that in watercolor and colored pencil and black pencil. And then I digitally go in with the type and overlaid some old paper on it to give it a more period feel. And the beauty of the lettering is based on my own hand lettering, but then turned into a computer font so that I can edit it, move it around, and it's on a layer so that when there's an adaptation like the one that was published here, they can easily remove the type and put the translation in. And there's the final book. So the horror, the famous line from the book. Don't stare too closely at this, it can cause blind rage. So here we are, up to the minute. Here's where I feel like I'm living in a country where there's an island of sanity in an ocean of crazy. And I'm trying to, I use my drawings as a way of thinking about it for myself, but also for kind of creating a connection with other people and talking about what's going on, like the latest Supreme Court ruling about abortion in the United States, which is completely insane, and Black Lives Matter movement. And sometimes, again, stylistically, I'm more interested in the idea than I am in the specifics of the art. I digitally altered. Actually, there's an idea my wife had. I digitally altered the famous Seurat painting to remove all the other people that were standing around. So looking at the world from our skewed perspective, one of the things that has happened from traveling is I've gone to places like Guatemala and seen the rainforest and then seen what's happened to it over the years. And so being witness to this transformation of the world that's going on. And this has been something that I certainly have noted from traveling and just, it seems so recognizable that we're in the midst of, we've been messing with the environment. And actually the very first place that I kind of learned about environmentalism came through underground comics. There was a comic called Slow Death, upbeat title, and it was sort of science fiction and fantasy, but also just sort of like the coming world, and it got me very nervous about that. I had the bomb to worry about and the environment. I wasn't a completely nervous kid, but these things were always percolating. So I got a really tremendous job. I sent a comic to Charlie Hebdo a couple of years ago and said, I don't know if you take solicitations from outside artists, but I have this wordless comic I did. And they were like, yeah, we like that. Do you want to do a new one every week for our environmental column? And that just fits so perfectly with my sensibilities. So they're all wordless. They actually run vertically. And I choose a headline from the newspaper, and then I do an idea to go around that. So just the oil companies ignoring the alarm bells here. And this is what you experienced this summer. I focused on France since that's where Charlie Hebdo is. And the melting glaciers, your ride takes you into a new terrain. So this has been something that has been on my mind for quite a while. And I try to use art, it's in a lot of ways it's like a catharsis where I get to talk about things that are really frightening me. And while I'm working on the drawing, at least I feel better. And when I look at the drawing afterwards, I'm like, eek, but the during, it's a sort of I try to remain positive, but it's difficult these days. But the beauty of art is it doesn't always have to show things. The worst end of it, sometimes you can draw the things you'd hope would happen, like, say, Russia getting out of the Ukraine and Putin disappearing. And maybe the crazy idea that we might get, affordable health care in the United States. And that, the tone of the story will be a song that I would prefer to listen to that isn't the drum beat of doom, but maybe reggae or classical music or rap. Choose your lovely art form. This was a stencil in Mexico. It said the revolution will not be televised, but I do believe it will be illustrated. And in that process, we are going to have to all work very hard to be kind to one another. And speaking of bees, my latest project, I kind of rediscovered a passion. I obviously had that from what you saw with the monarch butterfly flight, and I've been interested in this for a long time, but I really have been interested in it for a long time. It goes back, that's my first insect book that I got when I was 4, and there I am at age 10 with my insect collection. I loved insects to death, perhaps a little too much. I kind of wish I had gotten into photography instead of killing insects, but I just was so interested in them, and I wanted to see them up close, and that turned into that form of collecting. So there's a fellowship that they have at the New York Public Library in New York, the one that has the lions in front on 42nd and 5th Avenue, if you've ever been to New York. And I proposed the idea, it's like a 9-month fellowship where they give you a room at the library along with 14 other scholars, and to work on your project. They pay you, and you get to use the library's resources. And I got the fellowship by, I proposed I'm going to do the history of insects and where they intersect with humans, the people who studied them through history. And it was a remarkable moment to get this fellowship. In early February of 2020, they told me I was going to have it in September, right before the pandemic hit. And so I arrived at the library in the midst of the pandemic, and normally the way it's set up is you would get to talk to all these amazing people. There's the guy who won the Pulitzer Prize for poetry, and the guy who writes for the New Yorker, and historian who teaches at NYU, and editor at the LA Times. And they were like, no talking, stay in your little tiny office, wear a mask wherever you go. And also, by the way, the library is closed to the public. half the collection is unavailable to you, and the library is going to be empty. And I really wanted to cry when I first got there. There's another early shot of me. But weird thing happened. I started walking around the library in these empty rooms, and I thought, this project I'm doing, I had this sort of skeleton of what it was going to be. But I thought, what if the insects come into the library, and what if each room has an exhibition of an individual insect, and then people are gone, because they were, and it's like a post-apocalypse, but kind of an upbeat post-apocalypse, because you don't know what happened with the people. They're gone. And then the insects start talking to each other, and they're looking at the exhibitions, and wandering around. And that's a piece I did for the New Yorker. And they enter the library and crawling up the walls, and then there's a sort of a dialogue between them, and then they start discovering, because each room has a display. It's as if I just decided, hey, what if the whole library decided to have a giant exhibition about insects, and then everybody disappeared except for the insects, and they got real big because humans weren't around, and the oxygen level went up, and whatever I wanted it to be. And when I finished this fellowship, I started to have a really decent form of what this project would be, but it was really developing as I went, and it changed because of COVID. And there was somebody that worked at the library who I bumped into, just a low-level worker, and I asked him, are there any rooms in the library that I may not know about? And he said, well, did you know that the library runs under the park, the entire park that goes for 2 blocks right next to the library? And I was like, no, and he walked me down there. We looked at that and a few other places, and I just was, friendly with him. Well, it turned out he was in the room when they had a committee decision about doing an exhibition at the library after my fellowship was over, and they were like, we don't know what to do. Anybody have any suggestions? And he was like, excuse me, I know this guy who did these drawings of insects in the library, and I got this giant exhibition that from them asking me if I might want to do it to it being up was 4 months, which is normally it would be like years to get something going. And then it was up for 6 months, and it just came down in August. And I got to walk into this space and look at it and think about what could I do in the library. And I took pictures of the empty space, and then I photoshopped in these ideas. And one of them was, I wanted to have insects on the ceiling. And I was like, how far can I go with this? And they pretty much, they said the sky's the limit, and I exceeded that. And some of the monarchs are hanging down on little strings, and there's some of the insects are sticking off the wall. It was really super cool. And it also lasted for a long time, so that it didn't just come and go. But of course, COVID giveth and COVID taketh away, so there was never an opening. It was just up. And in fact, they don't close the library while they put these shows up, so people were walking through while we were hanging the show. And even the first day we started putting the show up, that we got just that one side of this put up, and then they announced there's been a COVID outbreak. It was Omicron, and we're shutting the library because we don't have enough security who's healthy to watch over things. Undefined time period. And I was like, well, I came that close. And I went home, and I promptly had COVID, and it lasted for about 5 days. And at the end of the week, they said, hey, we're opening up the library. People are getting better. And we put the rest of the show up. So it was a very interesting, process that landed things here. And so now I've been working on this book that is in the show, and some of the show is also from that book, Ruins, that I showed with the monarchs. One whole hallway shows the migration of the monarchs, so I was able to take up even more space. And I'm not sure if...
Yes, sorry, Peter.
Okay.
We're a bit running out of time.
We're running out of time, so if that's good.
This time we ask the audience if
Okay,
they have
if there's
some
any questions.
because we still have maybe 5 minutes. And
Quick
then,
questions.
Yes.
Okay.
So.
Anybody?
What?
Yes.
Okay, first question. Can I have 2
Sure.
short ones?
Yes.
The story of the banner for the exhibition here. What happened to it You posted this on your Twitter account.
I'm sorry.
The banner for the exhibition of this book in
Right.
Ljubljana, it became an item in your apartment.
Oh, right. That's right. I used it as a shower curtain.
Yes.
It was fantastic. Yeah. In fact, I have to bring that back out. Oh, it was so lovely. Every time I went to the bathroom, there's Kafka. Yeah, the huge banner in there. Thank you for reminding me. I put that away. I have to bring it back out. I didn't want to get too wet, but it was made a great shower curtain.
Okay, thank you. Second thing, what's your next project?
Well, you're looking at it. Or you were looking at it. Intersex is. So I've been working on that for 2 years now, and I have another year in order to complete it, which is definitely not enough time. I could probably use another 2 years, but I have the American publisher who did Kafkaesque and Heart of Darkness bought the book from me, so which is tremendous. I didn't have a fully formed idea that what I was going to do with this book, and then thanks to COVID, the library being empty and all that, I got my idea and put together a proposal. But I have many, many more pages to go, like 100 pages to draw between now and next September. I should actually get up and leave the stage, get on an airplane, go home and start drawing, but I love being here, so.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Peter.
Hello.
Are you getting more commissions now? Because it was really interesting to understand your story that 3 times you said you were almost had to end your career or it changed completely, and not many commissions, a lot of work for free. Are there many commissions now, especially on adaptation of literary classics coming, and that you refuse them maybe?
Well, I'm now doing this weekly strip for Charlie Hebdo, which sort of filled in for Spy vs. Spy. I thought had ended about a year ago, and that was the pay I was getting from doing Spy vs. Spy every 2 months has been replaced with doing Charlie Hebdo every week, and that's that takes a day or two of my week. I try to make it be a day, but whatever length of time it takes to get it right. And I have little other bits of things going, but right now, really, my focus is on this insect book, which is going to be a little bit of everything I think I know how to do. One of the great things about the book is I kept showing you all these formal ways I did the adaptations with the little breakdowns and all, and I can't seem to do it with this book. It's really, I'm kind of doing chapters, and I'm not sure where they're going to fall. And I really like that very much because it's like I get to be surprised in it, whereas the formal way of doing it, I like now know what the story is going to be, and it's going to do this. With Intersects, I keep on coming up with, well, I could go that direction with it, or the story expands as I do more research. And stylistically, I can change styles because the voice of an individual insect could maybe be a different style. So. No, I have. So the same publisher as Heart of Darkness and Kafkaesque in the United States, W.W. Norton, is doing it, and I suspect this will be my most available, broadly bigger audience project because it's covering so much history and a subject that I think a lot of people of all ages will be interested in, and it does very much touch on climate change because right now the insects are disappearing at an alarming rate. So that's part of the story is me trying to get people to appreciate insects and their importance in the world, but also tell these stories and the people who study them through the centuries, and that it's just I'm just so fascinated by them, and that I could work on this for years. But I also really like writing. Having done a couple of adaptations in a row, it's really nice to be writing things. I'm always getting little bits of other work. I pitch to the New Yorker sometimes. My work is syndicated as political cartoons. So I do those as I get ideas, but I'm really trying to stay focused on this particular project for the next time. And I think it'll be the kind of thing that will end up in natural history museums. It'll step out of the graphic novel, natural, maybe art museum or art gallery, and work into science a bit, which I'm really excited about. Anybody else? Yes.
Very simple question. Which insect do you find the most difficult to draw?
Difficult? Let's see. Well, this Cecropia moth that you saw me as a little kid holding has a very complicated wing and color. That takes quite a bit of time to draw, for sure. So yeah, it would be that moth. But the stories go down these different angles, and there's a lot. They get very complex as I tell their stories. So even like this cicada, that is an insect that goes into the ground for 17 years, stays awake, sitting there, sucking tree sap, and getting signals from the tree sap of when it's time to come out after 17 years, and also has some internal clock. But it's still kind of a mystery. They're not really sure exactly how it knows to come out. And I'm drawing every root in the ground because I have like a cutaway and time passing, 17 years. So there's a lot of complicated things to draw in this book. And actually, the library itself, which is the backdrop of the book, just drawing that takes, I'm not an architectural fellow, but I really am enjoying doing that. And obviously I'm using a lot of reference when I do those drawings, but I really have enjoyed drawing the little details in there, but that takes a lot of time. Anyone else before we wrap up, or is that good? I'm all ears. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming.